Joining us on the morning show from WRCO is Joy Kirkpatrick, Farm Succession Outreach Specialist for Wisconsin-Madison, Division of Extension. Good to have you along. Hello again.
Thanks. Yeah, good to be here.
You used to be a regular guest here on WRCO.
Yeah. When I first started in Extension, I was in Richland County. I was here for 11 years, and then now I'm at a statewide position, but my office, I actually have office space back in Richland County, so hopefully I'll be here more often.
That's good. That's a benefit for all of us. Are you glad to get back?
Yeah. I still work statewide, but have office space and then do a lot of work, like I said, outside of the area. So
Your position requires a lot of traveling then?
It used to require a lot of traveling, but since people are more comfortable with virtual programming and have, at least in some areas, have better access to a higher bandwidth of internet, we are doing a bit more live virtual meetings and doing some programming like that. But I still do travel around the state to do presentations and workshops, and then also work with farms one-on-one.
You'll be here for an upcoming workshop in Richland Center Thursday, March 6th. So, and you're hoping a lot of people that are hearing this are going to come out and be a part of it.
Yeah, we'd love to have people come to that program. It's going to be that Thursday evening, 6 to 9 p.m. And it's one of our programs that we kind of, what we're trying to do is develop levels kind of farm succession programming, where the what we call like awareness building is, if you're just thinking about farm succession, which is what we've kind of titled that program, this gets you started in finding out like what happens if you don't have a plan. My colleague, Kelly Wilford, who is an attorney, but now works for Extension, so she doesn't practice, right? She can't be your attorney, but she can talk about the law. She's going to talk about what happens if you don't have a plan, and the state has one for you. So talk a lot about all of the details around that kind of the legal issues, the tax issues, probate, long-term care. So that's kind of her area of talking about the planning pieces. And then I focus on communications and goal setting, and what can you do on your own or with someone else to help you with that planning, so that you're not having those conversations in front of the attorney or the accountant. You have a little better idea of what your goals are, what information they need is a bit more organized. So I talk a lot about like how can you prepare to be more efficient when you start using those paid services.
This is not an easy topic for people to talk about on the farms.
No, it isn't. It's such a mix of things. It's financial, it's taxes, it's legal, business structures and estate planning. But so much of it is sort of wrapped around it is that emotional component of family issues or legacy, talking about your legacy. So it's just a kind of a mix of all of those things. So we try to help people. A lot of my work is to try to help people figure out what it is that they need to talk about and how they talk about it, give them some terms that help them think through what it is they want to have happen with their business and with their assets.
Have there been a lot of changes in laws over the course of the last few years, Joy, in terms of what you can do, what you can't do, in terms of putting somebody's name on the dotted line?
Yeah. That's a Kelly question. That's the attorney. If somebody wants to know that, they can come that Thursday and ask her that question. I will say in general, there have been some changes in like estate taxes, right? Like when someone passes away, how much can they have in their estate? Like how much can they own at their time of death? That number has been going up. Right now, the way the law stands, that number is going to go back down as of January 1st, 2026, unless there's some laws that are updated or changed. I think that's maybe one of the things that a lot of people have been hearing about as a driver to do some estate planning, because that number right now is pretty big. I think it's like a little over 13 million per person somebody can own at their time of death. And if you think about a couple owning assets together, that multiply that times 2. So there are not a lot of farmers in the area in the state that have 26 million worth of assets that would end up being like anything over that gets taxed at the time of death.
Mm-hmm.
But if that law stays in place and that date of January 1st, 2026, if that law is still in place, then it could revert to something lower than that. Now, nobody knows exactly what that would be, but people are thinking like maybe $5 to $7 million per person. And in that case, if you're a single person owning a farm, depending on the size and the assets you have, you might have an issue about like how many assets you own at your time of death. So there might be some planning that needs to happen with that. The other thing that's changed now, and it doesn't seem recent now that when you said recent changes, in 2014, there were some changes at the state level about how aggressive the state would be on recovering Medicaid payments that had been made for someone who's having the state help them pay for their skilled care. So basically, a lot of people talk about the nursing home. So there were some changes on how the state could maybe be a little bit more aggressive in trying to get that money back after someone dies who's been in skilled care that the state paid for. So there was a flurry of planning that was going on after 2014 to try to figure out how can people who have these business assets that need to be available for the next generation, how can they keep them in place with that risk of if they go into care, would those assets be looked upon as something that could be used for recovery? So I think those are the two things that we hear a lot about because it's money, right? And it's especially that Medicaid recovery can feel very threatening to the business, the assets and the legacy of the business. So a lot of people want to talk about those. But the fixes, and I'm putting that word in finger quotes, they're not super attractive either, because a lot of times it means that you don't maybe have control of those assets until the time of your death, right? If you want to keep them protected, that also means maybe you're not owning them in the same way that you used to own them. And and then also thinking about what it is that you actually want to have happen to those assets is hard to think about too, because you're thinking about a lot of times families, and the research has been for a lot of years, they've talked about why people don't make wills. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're a farmer or not. Lots of people choose not to do that planning because they don't want to think about their own mortality. They don't want to think about their parents' mortality. There's all kinds of reasons that people don't do this planning. But when you don't plan, it really kind of puts you in this place and your assets in a place that they could be at risk anyway, right? So let's think about that risk level and start thinking about what you want to have happen, and put some of those plans in place. I think that in a lot of ways that can really reduce people's stress levels if they kind of like, well, if anything happens, at least we have this in place and we know that can happen. And I always encourage it from that idea, if you have a successor that's already in your business, how fair is it for that successor to not know what they need to be doing to plan for that inevitable, that thing that's going to happen is that those owners are going to die. We have not yet figured out how to not make that happen. So how fair is it, and how can not knowing what they need to plan for can really hobble the business in a way that they can't make plans for expansions or other things because they are maybe needing to have to figure out how do they buy the assets from their siblings, or the assets are maybe going to be used for care. There's all kinds of things that need to be discussed, and just a little bit of planning and a little bit of conversation can go a long way in thinking about what needs to be done.
I think too that you get into a situation like where you just kind of figure that it's just what's going to happen is going to happen, but maybe you throw in somebody gets remarried and you throw in another family and then you throw, there's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts.
Right. I think that's, you're talking about getting remarried. That's so interesting. The idea, when I talk with firm families, sort of the stereotypical, it's not happening as much anymore. But when I first started working in the succession planning area, it was always, people wanted to know, how can we keep the daughter-in-law from owning any assets, right? It was sort of like they make that evil daughter-in-law always the issue. And they don't think about, what if someone on that owner level passes away and the person who survives remarries? There's a whole lot of things that happen, because that's the level where so many of the assets are still being owned. And if there's not a marital property agreement put into place, or a conversation about, like, okay, yeah, we're married, but these assets are still going to be separate from our marital property, then at that level there are issues, and nobody thinks about that. They always think about that younger generation marrying someone that's not from a farm, or thinking about what kind of monkey wrench can be put in to the machinery in that sort of way. But we have to think about it a little more holistically about, those risks are who owns the most assets, and there's their risk level there. And then the other piece is who's doing the management and the labor. Their risk, if something happens to that generation, there's risk there as well. So just looking at it from both sides.
At what age should we start talking about that? I mean, are you a young farmer with young kids? I mean, is that the time, or what do you think?
Attorneys would say anybody over 18 needs to do some sort of planning, right?
Okay.
Because someone that's 18, their parents can't make healthcare decisions for them if something were to happen that they couldn't make those healthcare decisions themselves. So at the very least, right, we're talking about powers of attorney for healthcare, powers of attorney for finances. So if something were to happen to me and I'm not dead, but I can't pay my bills or make financial decisions, we need to identify someone who can do that for me until I get better or get to the point where I can do that myself. Or if I can't ever do that, somebody that's going to take care of that. The same thing for healthcare decisions. We need to have those kinds of things put in place so that, because if you don't choose someone and you don't have that in writing, then someone will be appointed and they may not do the things that you would want to have happen. So I think that anybody of that age, anybody who's an adult, needs to think about that. And then also if you have some assets, right? The next step is if you have kids, right? Like what would happen if you have children that are of an age that need to have in your documentation, you nominate a guardian, right? So that there's somebody that's like, hey, if something happens to us, there's somebody here that we would like to have take care. Now, the judge ends up deciding that, but if there's a nomination, if that seems to be work, then that's who they're going to choose for you. But if you don't have that in place, can you think about, if something happened to both parents and then the in-laws, the grandparents on each side, who's best to take care of them, or siblings on each side, right? Having to have that conversation when you're already grieving can be a very traumatic sort of situation. So thinking about things that you can do, because you know that there's going to be that grief piece when something happens. If you can take some decisions away from having to be made during that time, they're probably going to be more thought through. Mm-hmm. So just thinking about what can I do for my loved ones in a way that can make it so that the business has a fighting chance of continuing. The land has a fighting chance of staying within the family, if that's the goal. Just thinking about the things that you can do to make that easier for your family members when they're already going to be grieving.
This is good stuff for someone that's not even a farm owner.
Right, yeah.
You own land or whatever the case might be, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, anybody who has assets, anybody who has loved ones, it really is very broad as to what kinds of things you need to be doing.
How can people sign up for this upcoming event?
The easiest way, probably, especially with us being on the radio, is to call the Richland County Extension Office, and that's 608-647-6148. and they will take your information and make sure that you're registered. It's free. We do have an online registration form if you want to search for our the program through the extension office or through my name or thinking about farm succession. You'll be able to find that. But again, for those who are listening, the easiest way is to call the extension office.
I'm guessing in your time as a farm succession outreach specialist, you've probably seen a little bit of everything, haven't you? In terms of stories?
Everybody, when I meet with them, are like, "Have you seen anything worse than this?" Right? I'm like, I've seen a lot. So
some worst case scenarios. Then,
well, and everybody thinks it's bad. I think that's the one thing that if there's any sort of message I can share, is that people think their situation is super unique, right? And in some ways they are, right? Like just the fact that I'm the youngest of 7, that makes it different than somebody who only has 2 kids, right? So thinking about it in that way, yes, your situation is unique. But kind of universally, farm families have very similar challenges, right? They may financially not sure if the farm can carry another family. Pretty universal question that we get is the farm big enough to do what we want it to do financially? We talk about that a lot with farm families. One of the other things that's pretty universal is, I have one on-farm child who's helped me build this business. They've been on the farm since they were 18, but I also have other children who aren't a part of the farm, but there's this idea that they want to, leave something, an inheritance or something for those other children as well. And so just talking through that, like what could that look like? Maybe it's not going to be completely equal monetarily, but there's some sort of fairness conversation that comes about that. If you have more than one child and you're thinking about inheritance distribution, that's pretty common. So just the message is that yes, your situation is unique, but also know that there are a lot of other families that are dealing with these, and we have had those conversations with families, and a lot of the things that we'll present on March 6th can help get you thinking about, like, what is it that we could do to start analyzing and having conversations around that. The other thing is pretty universal is how to even start that conversation, right? I've had lots of workshops where families have come up to me, and like one dad said, I didn't even know my son was thinking about coming back to the farm or wanting to come back to the farm until he brought this brochure home from school and said, I think we should take this workshop. So having that even getting started conversation can be a struggle if, the parents or the owner generation don't want to place too much pressure, right, on the next generation. They want them to evaluate all their opportunities and have them come back because they want to, right? So they don't want to push because they don't want them to feel that pressure. And on the flip side of it, the successor generation doesn't want to start pushing questions and make it feel like they want the owner generation, to be just out, right? So there's this really fine dance of who's going to start the conversation, who is it most appropriate to start that conversation. I hear the owner generation say, well, I want to see them step up. And then the successor generation says, I don't see my place. So how do they step up if they've not been told they might have a place if they want to come back? So there's just this push and pull all the time.
Yeah, I'm sure there is. Or the older generation saying, they're just not doing it like they should, and, kind of overseeing it. Yeah.
There is, one of the things that I talk about a lot, there's this research that was done in Pennsylvania, and they interviewed a whole bunch of family members from different farms that were in various stages of succession planning, and they talk about the tensions of farm succession. That's kind of how this research project said, let's call them tensions rather than barriers or challenges, right? Let's name them, because so many families see these tensions, and if we can give them the words to start talking about them, hopefully they can start addressing them. And one of them is that loss of control, right? That owner generation is really thinking like, I've made these decisions for decades and it's going to be really hard for me to let someone else start making these decisions. Let's just say this is going to be hard. How can we have a conversation about to make that less, of a struggle for you? Some of the reasons that letting go piece might be a little bit hard is because so many farmers have reinvested all of their profits, profits back to that farm to expand it, to add more acres, to make it more attractive for that successor generation. So they may not have a lot of off-farm investments that we would call more liquid assets, right? Like, and they don't have opportunity for a 403B like I do working for the university, or for people who work for companies who might have a 401k or something like that. So they see reinvestment into the farm as a big part of also maybe some of their retirement planning. So then that does put a little bit more pressure on those assets to be retirement assets, maybe business assets, and then also those inheritance assets. So when we talk about letting go, some of the reluctance of that owner generation maybe letting go is because they're like, well, do I want this 25-year-old making decisions about my retirement assets, right? And we talk, maybe not at 25, but at 45, maybe they need to be letting go a little bit and figuring out ways to let that generation have those decision pieces. That fair versus equal is another one of the tensions that it's talked about a lot. The idea of profit over affordability. So this idea, like, especially in maybe places where there's a lot of development and the pressure of development can make the per acre value go way up. And we know that there aren't any farm enterprises that can really cash flow $14,000 an acre or $15,000 an acre. So do we sell it for profit, the highest profit we can possibly make, and maybe take that money and go someplace else and buy cheaper land? If you can find that these days, because even in these more rural farmland counties, what we're seeing is bigger farms and being very competitive about buying farmland because they need it for manure management, they need it for feed, those sorts of things. Or do we talk about what is it that owner generation needs for income, needs for a payment, and what can that farm afford, right? Like, I think that ends up coming down to it. So losing control, fair versus equal, that profit versus affordability. One of the other ones is the actual conversations versus assumptions, right? We assume that it's the oldest son that's going to come back, or, all of these kinds of things that don't have really explicit conversations that need to happen. Do you want to come back? When would you like to come back? Or when do we want you to come back? All of these things just really need to be talked about, just making assumptions of that one. And then one of them, the other one, I'm not going to remember the exact title, but it's this idea of you have this successor generation that's coming into the business, and maybe they've gone to school or worked someplace else, and they have a lot of ideas that they'd like to bring back to the farm and see if their management moves the needle in a positive way, makes a difference in how they do things. And then you have that owner generation who, for lack of a better way to describe it, they might say, well, we've always done it this way, right? Like, it's that change piece, right? Like, that owner generation might be looked at as maybe being a little more set in their ways on how things happen, where that successor generation's really wanting to make their mark. So there's that kind of tension that happens a lot. And what we try to have the conversation with those generations is that, look, that owner generation has done something right over the decades to be at a place where we can even have this conversation about succession planning. They've made some right decisions. They've, over the years, they've made those decisions to where we're at this point. So we need to give them some credit. And then for that successor generation, when we're talking to the owner generations, like, And that successor generation right now could be in what we call a completely different set of facts. Like the economics of farming is different. Regulations can be different. The, marketplaces, the market opportunities can be very different. So to say we've always done it this way and put those decisions on today's world can make it really hard. So we're trying to think about it in a way that what we want to stay the same is, if the family wants it, that it stays a farm, right? That it stays within the family. We have to have a conversation about those goals. And then to make those goals happen, that continuity happen, it might need to have some changes that show some just sort of progress kinds of things. So trying to really have those conversations across generations, because I know that there have been farmers who say, well, my kid's coming home and telling me all of these things that we need to change differently. And that owner generation may be taking that as if that successor generation is saying, you've done it wrong. All these years you've done it wrong. And I don't think that that's what that successor generation is saying. Maybe in some cases they might want to say that, but what they're saying is we might need to do things differently to make sure this stays in the family or stays a farm.
I know with your co-presenter, she's more of the legal person there.
Yeah.
But are there things that go along with protecting yourself in case you're in a long-term facility or whatever, you get sick or injured, and you hear those stories about, the state took the whole farm.
Yeah. I think that there are, like I said, there are some estate planning tools that people will consider and could perhaps help with that kind of protection. There's still, even with a lot of those tools, there is still that 5-year look back period is what they call it. So you may give away assets to your kids, right? To that next generation. You might move your assets into some sort of structure like a trust. But even with those movements, if you go into a facility and need state care within 5 years of making those changes, there's a possibility that some of those assets are still not protected because you didn't do it, and you've done it within 5 years. So again, I'm stepping into dangerous territory because that's but those are like high level things that and the thing, there's some work that's been done from Ohio, from the Ohio State University, some extension specialists that we kind of call colleagues, even though we're in different states. They've done some really interesting work that I think Kelly will talk about a little bit more on March 6th. There is a spreadsheet that they've designed to help people kind of think through what is their risk, right? Like you can say, well, how many years you think you're going to need maybe in-home care, right? I think that people think about this idea that it's the nursing home, right? But as we age, there are maybe increments of maybe for a lot of years, it's going to be unpaid family that's doing that supportive care around that those owners so that they have what they need. And then it's going to get to a point, they're going to need a little more care than what unpaid family members can do. So then you've got maybe some home health care that comes in and helps maybe with some activities of daily living, of like bathing or maybe preparing some meals or something like that. There's a cost to that we need to factor into this idea of what is it that's going to be needed as we age. Then there's maybe assisted living, which is a little bit cheaper than the skilled nursing care that they talk about, which is more the traditional nursing home kind of terminology. So let's think about let's include those home health care aid costs, right? So maybe you're going to need that for a couple of years. Maybe the average stay in a nursing home, I think it's around a year, an actual nursing home, right? But the number of years that you're going to need paid skilled care could be 3 because you've got these increments of different things. So this spreadsheet helps you think through some of that. It's got lots of resources as to thinking about how much does that cost in my county? how do I start thinking about how many years I might need those care, there's resources for that. And then it has you listing all of your assets. And it also has like any kind of income you're getting, like Social Security, if you have, any sort of pension, anything that might be coming in on a monthly basis kind of thing. Then you start listing your assets. So you might have liquid assets. You might have an IRA or, some savings or something like that. And then you start listing machinery, cattle, land. And the spreadsheet also takes into account that you might have to pay some taxes on those assets if you have to sell them, right? So it does all of those calculations, helps you think through those calculations and what that might be. And then it tells you you're going to use 100% of all your cash assets and maybe 100% of all of what we call more intermediate assets of machinery and cattle. And then they're going to have to start dipping into the land and maybe use 20% of the land. Well, if you can visualize that, 20% of my land, well, there's that one piece of property it's not really generationally owned. We bought that a few years ago. The taxes might not be as high on it because it was, we paid $3,000 an acre and now it's worth $6,000 an acre, right? The taxes might be a little bit nicer to us if we sell that. And it's across town and it's not going to really make or break the farm if we have to get rid of that. So it gives you real data based on your information as to well, then maybe we don't need all of these fancy tools because we know that we're going to tell everybody this is the first piece of property that we sell if we need care, right? These are the things that are going to go or whatever. Now, that doesn't help if you need to sell the cattle and machinery and those need to be in place for somebody else, right? But so there's all of those, then you wouldn't even put the machinery and cattle into that calculation because those need to be in place for that next generation. So really thinking through what is it that you can access for your care and what is it that we really, really need to protect. So it's not all or nothing. Maybe you don't have to put everything into this very locked down sort of tool. Maybe you only have to put a few things in there, right, to protect those, because those are the really particular things we want to protect.
Program coming up on March 6th at the Richland County Extension Office. Pretty cool to have something going on at Melville Hall, the administration building, right?
Yeah, we'll see how that goes.
But that's where it's at.
It is. Yep. It's at Melville Hall, yep. So it's, I'm kind of excited to be able to have something back out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And people can sign up. What's your phone number again?
608-647-6148. And you can talk to Sandy or Jenny.
Great. Fascinating stuff. Joy, good to see you again.
Yeah, thanks.
Joy, Kirkpatrick Farm Succession Outreach Specialist for Madison Division for Extension, and glad to have her along with us today on the morning show with this important information.